Just 2 days after Squaresoft launched their very first Final Fantasy game, Sega also launched their first JRPG, Phantasy Star, on December 20th, 1987 for the Master System in Japan and in 1988 in the West. The game was designed by Kotaro Hayashida, programmed by Yuji Naka, with graphic design by lead artist Rieko Kodama and music composed by Tokuhiko Uwabo. The development team had an unusually high percentage of women for the time, including designer Miki Morimoto and story writer Chieko Aoki. Phantasy Star was also the first project of Naoto Oshima, the creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, at Sega as a character designer. Phantasy Star's main difference from Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy is in its fused science fantasy setting and its advanced visual effects for the time. The developers mentioned finding influence in Star Wars for the game's setting. The game's characters had unique personalities and abilities. The game also featured 3D dungeon crawling and a female protagonist. In fact, Phantasy Star may be one of the first JRPGs ever made with a female lead protagonist. The game's story revolves around Alice Landale, who is on a journey to defeat the evil leader of her star system, King Lassic, after the king kills her brother. In her journey, she's eventually joined by 3 other party members. The game is in a top-down perspective when exploring, and in first person for battles or dungeon exploration. The 3D exploration would get confusing without players mapping them on paper. Battles are menu and turn-based, with options to talk to enemies or use a shared pool of items among party members. As characters level up from battles, they gain new magic spells and higher stats. For a game made in 1987, Phantasy Star has a fairly detailed story that spans multiple planets in the Algol star system. And one other thing that makes Phantasy Star unique as a pioneering JRPG series is the interconnectedness of the stories of its different games as they take place in the same universe, but often with entire millenniums separating the different games. In 1989, Phantasy Star 2 was released on the Sega Genesis in Japan, and 1 year later in the West. Phantasy Star 2 was a direct sequel to Phantasy Star, taking place over 9 centuries after the original game. The development team was largely the same, except Chieko Aoki also served as director for this game in addition to story writer, and Yuji Naka assumed the role of producer in addition to programmer. Phantasy Star 2 completely abandoned the first-person view for complete top-down view for exploration and third-person view for battles. Gameplay is otherwise very similar to the original Phantasy Star, with each of the 8 characters, including the main character Rolf, having their own preferred set of equipment and techniques they would learn. The game did have several things lost in translation or straight up changed between versions. Lutz is supposed to be the same character as Noah, who accompanied Alice from the original game, but the changes in name between games make this fact lost. In the Western version of Phantasy Star 2, the game takes place 1,000 years after Alice's adventure instead of 942 years. Phantasy Star 2 released to very good reviews in the West. The Genesis' larger cartridge size and its 16-bit graphics carried its strength, with people praising its visuals and elaborate character-driven plot. Phantasy Star 3 Generations of Doom was released for the Sega Genesis in Japan in 1990 and worldwide in 1991. This game made a dramatic change to the traditional gameplay loop by featuring a branching story with 3 generations of characters that would change according to the marriage partner of the previous generation. The auto battle feature and an icon-based menu system were also added to the game. The combat and progression systems were otherwise the same as previous games. Phantasy Star 3 had a completely different development team, and development itself was very challenging. Content had to be cut to fit on the cartridge, and the developers mentioned it being a project full of hardships. The game was still received well for its time though. My personal favorite entry in the series, and the only one I'd recommend to anybody who wants to play a game in the series, is Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, which released in Japan in 1993 and in the West in 1995 for the low price of $100. And we think $70 is expensive these days for a video game. I personally remember renting the game from Blockbuster Video to play it. Anyways, Rieko Kodama returned to the series as the director of Phantasy Star 4 this time. Phantasy Star 4 innovated on its gameplay with combination techniques for multiple party members and allowed players to set up macros to automate actions, including macros that would result in combination attacks. Manga-style illustrations added personality to the script, and the script itself was greatly expanded. Phantasy Star 4 takes place 1,000 years after Phantasy Star 2 and 1,000 years before Phantasy Star 3. Players control the hunters Alice Brangwyn and her young apprentice Chaz Ashley as they investigate a biomonster problem and its relationship to the declining ecology of their planet Motavia, a planet which has had its share of ups and downs across Phantasy Star games. The game reviewed well for its time, but not as well as Phantasy Star 2 and 3 did. However, the game has aged well with its turn-based combat systems, its pacing which heavily minimizes the need to grind, combo attacks which were fun to discover and effective to macro, and its plot which had a pretty memorable twist in there for anybody who played the game. The minimal grinding which led to better story pacing is the key to why I believe this game has aged so well, and it's a game definitely worthy of belonging in the golden era of JRPGs. While I don't think Phantasy Stars 1 through 3 are fantastic games even compared to other JRPGs that came out around the same time, the games definitely looked better and were able to use the stronger visuals of Sega's hardware to strengthened their decent storytelling, giving them that honeymoon period of hype for their time. Phantasy Star 2, in particular, visually blew away every other console JRPG at the time with its 16-bit visuals, when the NES was still pushing out 8-bit graphics for its headlining Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest JRPGs. Phantasy Star 3 had more competition when it released, but while the games looked better and the generational narrative was unique, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest were making fantastic innovations to their gameplay with job systems in Dragon Quest III and Final Fantasy III. Omnibus storytelling to accompany a diverse cast of characters who each got their own chapters to be the main character were introduced in Dragon Quest IV. Metal Max was already experimenting with open worlds and a variety of vehicular combat options. Romancing Saga was a blockbuster hit when it released in Japan as one of its first Super Famicom JRPGs, introducing a whole bunch of things people had never seen before in the genre and wouldn't see become features in other games for years. I also have to admit, I didn't play through the Phantasy Star series until after I played Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo, which for me, quite frankly, ruined a lot of the novelty Phantasy Star's graphical advantage had over its peers at the time those games were released in the late 80s, even if their stories were still interesting. Final Fantasy IV also ruined the novelty of Phantasy Star's interplanetary adventure, as Final Fantasy IV did feature a lunar arc too. I was also a stinky 9-year-old little kid at the time that probably didn't understand parts of the story like an adult would, which has also shaped my bias, but I have no desire to experience these games again as an adult. In other words, I'm not old and stinky enough to have been able to appreciate Phantasy Star for its time, but I still recognize it for pushing the JRPG genre forward in its own way. Phantasy Star 4 though, which I did get to play in its time, is still a fun game. Phantasy Star 4 is the last Phantasy Star game I was interested in, as its later games became more online multiplayer focused. However, the series has continued to have a presence over the years. Phantasy Star Online was released in the year 2000 on the Sega Dreamcast as the first console online RPG. It was an action RPG where players would play the game cooperatively with other players online, exploring the planet of Rhaegal as adventurers. It eventually received 4 episode updates up to 2005 after Sega left the console hardware business and decided to focus on third-party game development. While Sega eventually shut down all their servers due to low use, hobbyists have developed private servers and the game can still be played online. Phantasy Star Universe was released in 2006. Like Phantasy Star Online, it was an action RPG that could be played online or completely in a single-player mode with its original story. An expansion for this game called Ambition of the Illuminous was released a year later. Phantasy Star Zero was released on the Nintendo DS in 2008 in Japan, 2009 in North America, and 2010 in Europe and Australia. It inherited many of Phantasy Star Online's gameplay features, but was developed to introduce a younger audience to the games as a fresh start to the series. Phantasy Star Portable was released in 2008 in Japan and 2009 worldwide on the PlayStation Portable and served as a direct sequel to Phantasy Star Universe and its expansion, taking place several months after that game's story. The player could choose from one of 4 races and 3 character classes. It also let players play single player or online with up to 3 other players. Phantasy Star Portable 2 was released in 2009 in Japan and 2010 worldwide on the PlayStation Portable and was the sequel to the first game, taking place 3 years later. Players could import some of their data from the original game for a special weapon. The game also featured infrastructure play, allowing players to play multiplayer through internet rather than through a monthly subscription like many other titles in the series required. Japan re-released the game in 2011, titled Phantasy Star Portable 2 Infinity, adding a new character and a 5th race of characters, but this game was never released outside of Japan. Phantasy Star Online 2 released a year later as the successor to Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Universe in 2012 in Japan. This game has received 6 episode updates over 7 years since its release. The game wasn't released in the West until 2020 on the Windows and Xbox platform, and 2022 on the PlayStation 4. Phantasy Star Online 2 is a free-to-play online action RPG with microtransactions. The game includes a character creation feature with various races, a class system that can be changed at any time, and eventually the player will be able to subclass too. A massive updated shared universe game, Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis, released worldwide in 2021 to allow players to play multiplayer across all of the different platforms and regions that the game was released on: the Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox S, and Windows. This game has a few differences from the original. While the original game has actual dungeons, New Genesis focuses more on an open world field. New Genesis also takes place 1,000 years later on the planet Halpha. Phantasy Star Online 2 also got 2 anime series. The first was Phantasy Star Online, the animation, which included 12 episodes airing from January 7th, 2016 to March 31st, 2016. The second was Phantasy Star Online 2, Episode Oracle, which included 25 episodes airing from October 7th, 2019 to March 30th, 2020. There have also been spin-offs to the original series of games made for the Sega Game Gear in 1992. Phantasy Star Gaiden is an extraordinarily grindy turn-based JRPG taking place after the first game in the series. Phantasy Phantasy Star Adventure is a first-person puzzle adventure game. There were 8 text adventure games released as a series on the Sega Mega Drive for users of the Sega MegaNet modem in Japan called Phantasy Star 2 Text Adventures. These games were eventually released as part of a compilation on the Sega CD, and each one takes place shortly before the events of Phantasy Star 2, detailing what brought the characters together in that game. In addition to the anime series I've already mentioned, there were also game books, like Choose Your Own Adventure for Phantasy Star 1, Phantasy Star 2, and Phantasy Star 3. There was also a manga produced for Phantasy Star Online 2 called Phantasy Star Online 2 Episode 0. Sega published the Phantasy Star Compendium in 1995 that has all kinds of background information on the development of the series, expanded information on the game's characters, worlds, and lore, and clearly connected all 4 of the flagship turn-based RPG titles. Like a lot of games in the 90s, there was also a drama CD and fanbook titled Phantasy Star Memorial Drama, released in 1995, telling a story 3 years before the start of Phantasy Star 4. There are definitely English fan translations for at least some of these books and CDs available online for anybody interested in looking for them. There have been several remakes and remasters of the original 4 games. A few were cancelled before they were finished. Fortunately, if you're interested in playing the first 4 Phantasy Star games in 2024, Sega has at least given people accessible options to do so. Phantasy Star 2, 3, and 4 are 99 cents on Steam. They can also be played on certain Sega Genesis Classic compilations released on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. The most recent and probably best option due to the game's mapping feature for Phantasy Star 1 that I could find was the Sega Ages Collection on the Nintendo Switch. However, if emulation doesn't offend you and you can back up your original copy of the game for the Sega Master System, that's always an option too. While Phantasy Star is by no means my favorite series of JRPGs, it definitely had its place in moving the genre forward in the late 80s and early 90s. I personally love the character designs of the series, and the settings are cool too. I think Phantasy Star 4 is still a fun game worth playing even in 2024 if 90s era game design doesn't deter you. It also served to launch Ryoko Kodama's incredible career in producing great JRPGs for Sega that people still talk about today, like my personal favorite Dreamcast game, Skies of Arcadia. And while the 7th Dragon series is very niche in the West, she produced those games too across portable platforms in the 2010s. Unfortunately, Ryoko Kodama passed away in 2022, but her legacy for pioneering the visual design of the early Phantasy Star series and producing memorable JRPGs for Sega will live on forever among fans of JRPGs. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.